hit record. It's recording now.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 20th annual New Sweden History Conference. Our topic this year is Home on the Delaware, Vernacular Architecture in the Delaware River Valley from 1600 to 1767. My name is Luann DeCunzo, and I am pleased to introduce you to one of our speakers this afternoon. Our speaker today is Jeroen van den Hurk. He is an assistant professor and coordinator of the Noreen Stoner Drexel Cultural and Historic Preservation Program at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island, where he's been since 2017, and where he's also currently a diversity faculty fellow. Dr. van den Hurk was educated at Utrecht University in the Netherlands and the University of Delaware, where he received his PhD in 2006 in art history. In his time at UD, he was the recipient of a dissertation fellowship from McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and also served as a research assistant for the university's Center for Historic Architecture and Design. Prior to joining the faculty at Salve Regina, he served as a principal architectural historian and historian for Commonwealth Heritage Group in Tarboro, North Carolina, and was an adjunct faculty member in historic preservation at the University of Kentucky. He has received the Hendricks Manuscript Award from the New Netherland Institute for his research on Netherlandish architecture in New York. He has published extensively on this topic in Dutch and in English journals. Today, he's speaking on his area of expertise, and his title, as you can see here, is Built After the Dutch Model, Vernacular Architecture in the Delaware Valley. Dr. van den Hurk.
Thank you, Luann, for the introduction. I'll make sure that all our electronics work. There we go. On the morning of Tuesday, June 5th, 1744, Dr. Alexander Hamilton of Annapolis, Maryland, arrived in Newcastle, Delaware. This was, of course, not the Alexander Hamilton from the musical, because he wasn't even born then. Dr. Hamilton had departed from Annapolis on May 30th on a 4-month journey that would take him along the East Coast up to New Hampshire and back. And on the screen, you see an early view from Newcastle from the Delaware River. Upon his arrival in Newcastle, he commented upon the geography of the town and that the houses were built chiefly of brick after what he referred to as the Dutch model. Hamilton attributed this Dutchness to the fact that the town had been founded and inhabited by the Dutch, and in his opinion, a great many of the houses are old and crazy. Relative architecture of New Netherland, and even less about its settlements along the Delaware or the South River. As this presentation will combine the information gleaned from the surviving colonial manuscripts, contemporaneous references to the built environment, including a few travel accounts, and a few surviving buildings to piece together what they have built. It is important to understand which cultural blueprints these settlers had in mind and the extent to which the structures reflected the architectural traditions in the Dutch Republic and the Low Countries, even though they were living in one of the earliest melting pots in colonial America. The Delaware River was at the southern end of the colony of New Netherland, which stretched from present-day Lewis, Delaware in the south to Albany, New York in the north, and initially to Hartford, Connecticut. It was just a small part of the charter that had been granted to the Dutch West India Company by the States General of the Dutch Republic in 1621, a charter that also included parts of West Africa, South America, and the Caribbean. The Dutch West India Company's primary purpose was to interfere with Spanish interests in those regions. It followed in the footsteps of the highly successful Dutch East India Company, which had received its charter in 1602. The directors of the West India Company were never much interested in colonization, and it remained a byproduct of its charter. But in 1624, the company made its first serious attempts to settle New Netherland, to establish a permanent fur trade with the indigenous people in the region. New Netherland had a fairly short lifespan. Looking at the bigger picture, 40 years of Dutch rule ended with the surrender of the colony to the English on September 8, 1664, and on the screen you see a rather fanciful image showing that occurrence. The West India Company not only handed over the territory to the English, but also legal documents pertaining to the everyday administration of the colony, 12,000 of which survive. Among these documents are multiple entries related to the architecture of New Netherland, including several building contracts. A careful study of the 17th century building contracts and other references to the built environment contained in these documents, and a comparison with examples from the Dutch Republic provide evidence of the architecture constructed by the original settlers of New Netherland. Comparing this information with buildings that survive from the last quarter of the 17th century indicates that the building traditions carried over by the settlers of New Netherland have a clear connection with those practiced in the Dutch Republic during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. A comparison of the surviving building contracts from New Netherland with 17th century building contracts from the Dutch Republic reveals that they were very similar in their tripartite format, their formal language, and the nomenclature used to describe the technical aspects of the buildings. And on the screen you see one of these surviving contracts from New Netherland. This indicates a mirroring of Netherlandic traditions by the settlers of New Netherland. Several significant features distinguish Netherlandic architecture from its English counterpart. One key feature of Netherlandic architecture was the use of a structural bend system, with braces that set it apart from the so-called box frame used by English settlers. The bend system played a pivotal role in Netherlandic framing, and on the screen you see a basic example of a bend. The bend system lay at the core of Netherlandic architecture and determined framing techniques and building design in the Low Countries well into the 17th century. Each bend consisted of two principal posts, connected by a girder or tie beam, and braces reinforced the joint between each of the principal posts and the girder to prevent racking due to wind forces. The braces not only had a structural function, but also an aesthetic one. The aesthetic function was similar to that of the summer beam in English architecture with its variety of chamfers and chamfer stops. And on the screen you see an example of two braces from the Dutch Republic. The braces remain visible within the living spaces of the house. And in the Dutch Republic, carpenters often added a carved corbel piece or shaped them in an S-curve to ornament them. Hardly any buildings survive from the period of New Netherland. However, other sources can give an insight into the built environment during this period. Most of this information, though, relates to the northern part of the colony. We can take one of these contracts as an example and try to reconstruct a dwelling that no longer survives and get an impression of the architecture of the early settlers. Despite its late date, the contract I have selected gives the most insight into these traditions. On February 21, 1661, Annette Dirks appeared before Salomon Lacher, who was a public notary in New Amsterdam. Together with Willem Abramsen van der Borde and Dionys Isaacsen van Hartelsveld, the latter two both house carpenters, to agree upon the terms for the construction of a dwelling. And on the screen you see the first page of this contract. The written contract was not only beneficial to the client, who would be guaranteed that his or her requests were fulfilled, but also to the contractor taking on the work, since it gave him a similar amount of legal recourse in case the client changed his or her mind while the work was in progress. The second section of the contract not only provides us with crucial information about dimensions and framing, but also with interior and exterior finishes. It is here that we find clear references to the intended buildings. The terminology used gives an indication of the architecture which was lost over the following centuries. It is furthermore this terminology which provides us the most unambiguous link between the architecture of New Netherland and that of the Dutch Republic. Annette Dirk's dwelling had to be 45 feet long and 24 feet wide. The structural framework of the house had to consist of 11 bents, 5 of which with braces on either side, and on the screen you see the skeletal frame of these 11 bents. The structural logic of the bent system determined which bents required braces and which did not. The gable ends did not need braces since they received their rigidity from the exterior siding. The boards or bricks of a partition wall stiffened the bent at a partition, and the headers of a chimney or stair opening would reinforce the connection between two bents and diminish the need for additional braces. Besides its size and cost, Annette Dierk's dwelling was the costliest of all surviving contracts at 1,500 guilders. The dwelling was exceptional in other ways as well. One of which was that the contract called for a cellar kitchen. Despite the high groundwater table in the Dutch Republic, the Dutch used various types of cellars for both domestic and commercial purposes. And on the screen, you see a cellar kitchen from a house in Amsterdam in the Netherlands from the 17th century. The contract also called for a winding staircase with a door to go to the upper floor. The watercolor on the screen shows such a paneled winding staircase from the 17th century. Other contracts that mentioned a stair usually only required a straight flight of stairs. The contract for the dwelling for Annette Dierks is one of the few contracts from New Netherland that gives us specific details about the roof structure. Most of the contracts often make no mention of a roof or just stipulate a common rafter roof. In Annette Dierk's case, it's also the only one to clearly assign a function to the upper floor, namely for additional sleeping quarters, since the contract called for 2 cupboard beds in the attic. And on the screen, you see a reconstruction of the roof truss, also known as a purlin bent. The roof truss stipulated in the contract not only required a purlin and a plate, which supported the rafters, but also allowed for the addition of a garret. The roof structure also had to be sturdy enough to carry the weight of pan tiles, just in case. As for siding, the contract called for planks, planed on one side and nailed to each other. In some cases, the contract only required the carpenter to enclose the building all around. None of the contracts refer to brick as a siding material. And on the screen, you see a detail of the Visser map, which I showed you earlier, and it shows frame houses outside the fort at New Amsterdam with both vertical and horizontal siding. The contract for Annette Dierks was more specific about the appearance of the facade. It called for 2 small window frames at the cellar level and a panel door. On the first floor, a stoop, as in front of Martijn Krugier's dwelling, and a door with transom lights and 2 crossbar windows, 2 two-light windows at the attic level, and a cloister frame at the garret level. We do not know what the stoop in front of Martijn Krugier's dwelling looked like. The detail from the bird's eye view of New Amsterdam from around 1660 shows Krugier's dwelling, but does not appear to have a stoop. The 3 window types referred to in the contract for Annette Dierks have a clear Netherlandic ancestry. On the screen, you see an example of the crossbar window stipulated for the first floor, known as een kruiskozijn in Dutch. In early versions, the glazed sections at the top would be fixed, and there would be no glass behind the shutters at the bottom. The 2 light frames required for the attic level were known as een bolkozijn in Dutch, which practically is a crossbar window cut in half horizontally. The so-called cloister frame, known as een kloosterkozijn in Dutch, had to be placed at the garret level. You can sense the modular nature of these windows, since this would be a crossbar window cut in half vertically. The scale of these windows could, of course, be altered depending on their location. On paper, then, this was a very Netherlandic type of architecture, with its use of a structural bend system with braces, the Netherlandic window types, and particular spatial divisions, among other features. And on the screen, you see a reconstruction I've been working on based on the surviving contract. The construction of Annette Dierk's contract from 1661 serves somewhat as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Still, other sources confirm the Netherlandic nature of the built environment. On the screen, you see potentially one of the earliest views of New Amsterdam from 1650, which shows the settlement with a variety of front and step-gabled buildings. The detail of the cartouche of the Visser map was based on this image. In front of the fort on the left, we see numerous 1.5-story front-gabled frame dwelling houses, whereas at the center, we see several of the stone or brick-gabled, stepped-gabled warehouses built by the Dutch West India Company. We also have various written sources which tell us about the architecture. In 1697, Dr. Benjamin Bolovant had traveled from Boston to New York and had commented on some of the architecture in New York City. According to him, the ancient buildings were very mean, but the newer building stock had much going for itself. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, what Bolovant described in his diary as the newer building stock was a traditional type of Netherlandic architecture. Tall and narrow buildings with brick facades and the gable end facing the street. Ceiling heights of 10 to 12 feet on the first floor were the norm, and combined with tall windows, this created light and airy living spaces. On the screen, you see Bolovant's sketch of the tip of Manhattan, and notice the two potentially step-gabled buildings on the right. An 18th century drawing confirms Bolovant's observations and very accurately follows his description. This drawing of a street in New York City by the Swiss naturalist Pierre-Eugène du Cimetière dates to around 1767. The far left of the drawing shows a 5-story building with a step-gabled end facing the street. The date anchors suggest the building was completed in 1689 and would have been fairly new by the time of Bolovant's visit. The only two numbers visible in the building next to it, a 1 and a 7, indicate that this practice at least continued into the beginning of the 18th century. So what do we know about the southern part of New Netherland? The patroonship of Zwanendal, which is Swans Valley in Dutch, was established in 1631 at what is now Lewis, Delaware. And on the screen you see an early map of the bay. Patroonships were small colonies within the larger colony of New Netherland. They were a compromise within the Dutch West India Company that allowed private investors to colonize an area at their own expense. The patroonship of Delaware was short-lived, and any future attempts were initially abandoned. When I first saw this building, I thought I'd found a missing link. Of course, it was not built until 1931 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the first settlement at Zwanendal. And just for a reference, it is a half replica of the town hall of Hoorn in the Netherlands. But what can we learn about the architecture in this region? Among the 12,000 records that survive from the period of New Netherland, there are some references to the architecture along the South River. The oldest one is a deposition given in March of 1639 by Gillis Pietersen van der Gouw, a master carpenter for the Dutch West India Company. Van der Gouw mentioned the construction of a large house in Fort Nassau. His deposition also stated that the fort itself was in decay. One of the downsides of the location of Fort Nassau was that the Native Americans had to cross the Delaware to trade with the Dutch. As the Dutch West India Company focused its attention on the Hudson River, the Swedish South Company saw an opportunity to establish New Sweden in 1638 under the noses of the Dutch. And on the screen, you see a map of New Sweden. The inconvenience of Fort Nassau's location was recognized by Peter Minuet, the first director of New Sweden, who bought land on the west side of the river near present-day Wilmington, where he constructed a trading post named Fort Christina. Minuet was one of the key players for the Swedish South Company. He had also been one of the early directors of New Netherland, but had been removed from this post in 1632. However, the Dutch West India Company still considered the Delaware part of its territory. In 1651, Director General Peter Stuyvesant of the Dutch West India Company responded by demolishing Fort Nassau and moving the ordnance to the west side of the river to a newly constructed trading post named Fort Casimir. It was a sort of chess game involving constructing and obstructing between the Dutch and the Swedes to gain an advantage in the fur trade with the Native Americans. Prior to 1651, there are sundry letters from Stuyvesant in New Amsterdam to the commissary at Fort Nassau under his Hudde. In one letter, written at some point between 1648 and 1650, Stuyvesant thanked the commissary for a shipment of eel. I will assume that was smoked eel, which is still considered a delicacy in the Netherlands. After the pleasantries, Stuyvesant wrote that at the request of the commissary, he sent a carpenter, Pieter Cornelissen, who was to assist with the repair of a house that belonged to the West India Company. We know a little bit more about Pieter Cornelissen since he was also mentioned as one of the carpenters in a contract from 1642, where he was tasked to build a house barn, which is a type of Dutch farmhouse, together with Abraham Klok for Johannes Winkelman in what is now part of northeastern New Jersey. More concrete information about the built environment along the Delaware comes from a contract between Paulus Leenderser van de Grift and the builders Simon Roth and Reinier Somerson from 1649. It is perhaps the only surviving contract that specifically refers to the construction of 2 dwelling houses on the South River. As with most of the surviving contracts, the instructions are just the bare basics. This can be attributed to the existence of so-called elaborate and restricted codes. Both parties involved would be well aware of the essentials based on shared traditions, and the contract would only list the essentials of the building, with such terms as sufficient, necessary, good, and neat, ensuring the proper workmanship. The concept worked in any cultural setting, in this case in New Netherland, but it could also apply to the English settlements in colonial America. The fact that a client requested certain elements ensured that the building would meet his requirements. This did not necessarily mean that elements that the contract did not specifically mention were not required. In certain cases, specific features and techniques were part of a shared vocabulary and did not need to be spelled out. In some cases, a reference to an example would suffice, such as the stoep in front of Martijn Krigier's dwelling in Annette Dirk's contract mentioned earlier. Or a construction drawing would clarify some of the questions a contractor may have. Of the latter, there are no known examples for New Netherland. In other cases, the existence of public ordinances may explain certain omissions. For instance, fire ordinances that would require or prohibit the use of certain materials. At times, therefore, that which is not written is just as important as that which is. If a contract, for instance, required a mantelpiece but did not mention a chimney, it is safe to assume that the client would have expected one to be there. That assumption may also work the other way as well, when the contract called for a chimney but neglected to mention the mantelpiece. The contract from the South River required the footprint of both houses to be 18 by 32 feet, the length of the beams, 13 feet, the height of the first floor, 9 feet. These were not the dark and low-ceilinged homes so often suggested for the early settlers. The position of the tie beam also meant that there would be approximately 4 feet above, creating the typical Netherlandic H-bend. The contract called for 5 doors. They would be both interior and exterior doors. 3 of the tall 2-light windows, the cloister frames, 1 large crossbar window, and 2 of the horizontal 2-light windows. There also had to be 3 partition walls as most convenient, and the roof was to be covered with boards. On the screen, you see a reconstruction of the building in both plan and section. It was possible that the carpenters placed one of the partition walls at the center of the dwelling, since the contract also required back-to-back chimneys. The second partition wall could be placed along the passage, and the third could screen off the cupboard beds in the back room. The isometric reconstruction shows the cupboard beds at the back of the house and the chimney at the center. The carpenters had to cut the lumber within 200 steps of where the houses were to be built, and the client would pay for the transportation of the lumber to the building site. The client had to provide the carpenter and his mate with food and drink, but they themselves would be responsible for the cost of getting back to Manhattan. Despite the Dutch West India Company's focus, despite this, the Dutch West India Company focused most of its attention on the North River, what we now call the Hudson, giving the Swedes an opportunity to capture Fort Casimir on May 30th, 1654. They renamed it Fort Trafalgar. 60 months later, however, Stuyvesant came back with a warship and 200 soldiers to take back the fort and control of the Delaware once and for all. Correspondence also survives from this later period that can give us some insight into the built environment on the Delaware. Jan-Paul Jacquet was appointed vice director on the South River and given specific orders by Stuyvesant related to various issues, some of which dealt with the built environment. For instance, no houses were to be built along the marsh side of Fort Casimir, and instead Jacquet had to promote the settlement on the south side of the fort. He was to lay out a good street behind the houses that apparently had already been built and lay out plots of 40 to 50 feet wide and 100 feet long. The street itself had to be at least 4 to 5 rods wide. In 1657, the Dutch West India Company finally settled its debt with the city of Amsterdam for their help with getting rid of the Swedes. The Dutch West India Company transferred the area from Christina Kill to Boompjes Hoek, which is now known as Bombay Hook, to the mayors of Amsterdam. The city of Amsterdam planned to settle and exploit this area on the Delaware as its own colonial venture in the New World. They named the new settlement Nieuw Amstel. After 1664, of course, it became Newcastle. The first director of the city's colony was Jacob Ulrichs, an old West India Company official with experience in Brazil. In a letter from 1657, Ulrichs reported on the deplorable state of the buildings at Nieuw Amstel and mentioned that one of the buildings was covered with oak shingles that had shrunk and were rotten. In subsequent correspondence, Ulrichs requested the shipment of various building materials and tools, as well as sending carpenters and brickmakers to Nieuw Amstel. In the following years, there are sporadic references to the built environment, but not enough to get a clear picture of the kinds of buildings that were constructed. Upon closer inspection, it is possible to find traces of the original settlers along the Delaware River, although some are less obvious than others. Dendrochronology has shown that the Reeves Holt House in Lewis was built around 1665, making it the oldest known house in Delaware. Due to changes over time, it may not look very Netherlandic on the exterior. The door and two bays at the right are the oldest section, which originally was a story and a half high. At some point, the owners extended the house above the original plate, making it a two-story dwelling, and also added to the left. The structural frame of the oldest part of the Reeves Holt House consists of H-bends, and on the screen you see a reconstruction, isometric reconstruction, showing that skeleton of the original part of the Reeves Holt House. The lack of braces may suggest a transitional framing technique that combined different traditions. For Newcastle, we have Hamilton's account that a great many of the houses are old and crazy, which he attributed to the Dutch origin. Of course, we have to realize that Hamilton's understanding of what was Dutch was colored by complex perceptions of ethnicity. Hamilton viewed the world through English eyes. However, one of the buildings Hamilton undoubtedly saw was the so-called Tile House, which stood in a prominent location on the Strand. And on the screen, you see another version of this view of Newcastle with the stepped gable of the Tile House at the center. The Tile House is dated to 1687, according to its wall anchors, which are unfortunately one of the few things to survive from the actual building. And I realize that these numbers here are in the wrong order. The well-known architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe recorded the building in his survey of Newcastle in 1805, although Latrobe may have taken some artistic license when he made the drawing. Its existence, however, supports the survival of New Netherlandic urban traditions, even in a town like Newcastle. A late 19th century photograph taken just before its destruction shows that by that time it had already lost much of its original character. However, enough evidence survives to indicate that it mirrored the urban Netherlandic traditions as seen in New York City, as observed by Dr. Benjamin Bolovant in 1697 and recorded by Du Cimetière in 1767, with its use of wall anchors and stepped gable end turned towards the street. I've worked on a reconstruction of based on Latrobe's drawing, the late 19th century photograph and Sanborn maps, and you see that reconstruction, what it may have looked like originally on the screen here. Perhaps a building that many of you have been waiting for is the old Dutch house, also in Newcastle, which by name, of course, would be an obvious candidate. It dates to around 1700, and similar to the Reeves Holt House in Lewis, its current appearance doesn't shout out its potential Dutchness. The structural core of the building, however, consists of 4 H-bends set 8 feet apart without braces, which may suggest a connection with the architecture of New Netherland. More recent research in southern New Jersey has uncovered the use of a simplified H-bend in small dwellings dating from the middle to the last quarter of the 18th century, associated with the early settlers of the region. The timbers are much smaller than those used in Netherlandic architecture in the Hudson Valley, and most braces have been omitted. The occurrence of the tradition in southern New Jersey is, of course, less surprising because of its proximity to the Dutch settlements across the Delaware River and the presence of Dutch settlers on both sides of the river. However, what is more surprising is its persistence among competing timber framing traditions brought to the area by English settlers. What becomes clear is that what Hamilton identified as a Dutch model truly existed, whether or not his interpretation of it was correct. If we look at the surviving colonial architecture in the part of the Delaware Valley settled by the Dutch West India Company, it will be hard to find buildings built by the first wave of settlers. However, if we study the records more closely and look more closely at the colonial buildings that survive, we may be able to discover their original intentions. Despite its short existence, the surviving colonial manuscripts suggest that the settlers of New Netherland were able to transplant some of their cultural traditions to North America. The few surviving buildings suggest that the built environment was shaped by the melting pot that was New Netherland, the number and skill level of the specific craftsmen, and the availability or lack of certain building materials. Architecture is also naturally susceptible to change. As the needs and tastes of the occupants change, so does the appearance of a building, with non-structural changes occurring more easily. A key feature that survived the longest was the structural bent. Whereas most people are familiar with the Dutch history of the Hudson Valley, the records show that similar traditions were carried over to the Delaware, perhaps be it on a smaller scale. Melding the evidence of buildings and documents provides a richer understanding of New Netherlandic architectural origins, of its evolution, and its survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very excited to engage in a conversation with you and the other panelists. And so I want to remind our audience before we conclude here that we invite you to join the live panel discussion with Jeroen and our other speakers on Saturday, the 31st of October, between 1 and 2 p.m. Please email your questions in advance of the discussion as directed when you register for the conference. And we will see you all on the 31st. Again, thank you. Thanks, Jeroen.
Thank you.